My 3 children told me I was finally good for something. That's the first thing I remember, Brian's voice cutting through the antiseptic air of Silvercrest Medical Center like a blade. Not the beeping monitors. Not the ache beneath my ribs. Not even the fear that came with hearing the word cancer. Just that sentence. I didn't react. Not outwardly. My fingers tightened around the edge of Marilyn's old scarf, tucked beside me in the bed, so lightly you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. The fabric was worn soft from years of her twisting it in her hands during long appointments, and now I found myself doing the same. I looked at my children. Really looked at them. Brian stood stiffly at the foot of the bed, trying to look serious but unable to hide the restless shift of a man who had somewhere else he'd rather be. Jenna hovered near the wall, arms folded, eyes shining the way they did when she was trying too hard to look emotional. Kyle lingered by the door, shoulders tense, jaw working like he was chewing on a worry he didn't know how to swallow. They weren't monsters. Not outright. But they also weren't here for me. Only now, after 2 years of silence, did they show up. 2 years after Marilyn died. 2 years after they blocked my calls. 2 years after the ER night when I sat alone with chest pains under a flickering light, realizing I had become an afterthought. And now. Now they acted like family. I forced a thin smile. Didn't expect you all at once. Jenna lifted her chin. Dad, you should have told us sooner. But her voice trembled in a way that didn't quite match her face. Kyle cleared his throat. Yeah. We would have come. Would they? After everything? After the silence? After the messages that never went through because the numbers no longer connected? Then Brian asked it. Not gently. Not hesitantly. So, how long did the doctor say you have? Not are you okay? Not do you need anything? Not can we help? Just a calculation. A timeline. Their eyes shifted between each other, quiet signals passing back and forth like they were preparing for a meeting rather than standing at the bedside of their father. And as they waited for my answer, I felt something in my chest, not pain, not grief. Something calmer. Something sharper. Because they had no idea that the moment they walked into this room, they weren't just visiting a dying man. They were stepping directly into the consequences of their own absence. And I was already years ahead of them. After Marilyn died in March 2021, the world didn't pause. But I did. I drifted through the days like a man made of glass. The house felt wrong, too wide, too cold, too full of the space she used to fill. I kept her mug by the sink. I kept her slippers beside the bed. And sometimes, without thinking, I'd call into the hallway, honey. And the echo that came back felt like being punched. The kids came around at first. Not lovingly. Not cruelly. Just, awkwardly, the way people act when grief is in the room and they're afraid they'll catch it. Brian offered help with paperwork but spent more time staring at Marilyn's old filing cabinet than at me. Jenna brought flowers, hugged me a little too tightly, then casually asked if Mom had ever decided what to do with the house. Kyle sat beside me on the porch one evening, quiet for a long time, then admitted work was slow and things were tight lately. They weren't villains. They were just human in all the ways that hurt. April 9th. I woke with a crushing pain in my chest. Not the sharp kind, this was slow, squeezing, as if someone had placed a cinder block over my heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the blanket Marilyn used to pull over my shoulders when I got cold. My breath came in quick, shallow pulls. Not now, I whispered. Please, not now. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I called Brian first. Dad? I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back? I tried to say no, tried to tell him I was scared, but he'd already hung up. Jenna was next. She texted back. Can't talk. Teaching. Everything okay? I told her I thought something was wrong. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. No reply. Kyle answered after 4 rings, sounding half asleep. Dad, it's probably anxiety. Just lie down. I gotta work early. He didn't wait for my response. The pain got worse. By the time I reached the ER, sweat soaked through my shirt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone coughed violently in the corner. A nurse handed me a clipboard, and I dropped the pen twice trying to fill in my name. A doctor walked by wearing the same brand of cologne Marilyn used to tease me for wearing too much of. The smell hit me and my throat tightened. I sat there, alone, staring at the automatic doors. Every time they opened, I expected one of my children to walk through. They didn't. When the doctor finally told me it was a panic attack, not a heart failure, I nodded, but something inside me cracked clean in half. On the Uber ride home, my phone buzzed. Not from my kids. From my pharmacy, reminding me to refill a prescription. The next morning, I tried calling each of them again. Not angrily. Not accusingly. Just a father trying to reach his children. Brian's number went straight to voicemail. Jenna's didn't connect. Kyle's rang once, then cut off. I checked twice, then 3 times. Blocked. All 3. They hadn't just ignored me. They had erased me. Summer came. I sat on the porch through heat waves, watching other families walk dogs, push strollers, grill dinner. I would catch myself lifting my head every time I heard footsteps, hoping, like a fool. I mailed them each a letter in December. Not asking for money. Not complaining. Just telling them I missed them. I wrote. I don't know how to do this without you. I held the envelopes against my chest before sliding them into the mailbox, as if warmth could make them reach further. None of them wrote back. The world kept turning. Holidays passed. My hair thinned. The house grew quieter. I learned the rhythm of loneliness. The silence didn't just hurt. It clarified. I began to understand something I had never dared to say out loud. My children loved the version of me that was useful. The day after my diagnosis, the house felt wrong. Heavier. Like the air itself knew something was coming. I made myself tea, pulled Marilyn's blanket over my lap, and tried to sit still. The scent of her lavender detergent still clung to the fabric. Sometimes I pressed it to my cheek just to remember what warmth felt like. I didn't get more than 5 quiet minutes before someone arrived. The knock was brisk, efficient, like everything Brian did. He walked in without waiting for me to answer. Dad, he said, placing a bag on the counter, thought I'd get you something warm. Inside, an overpriced soup and a loaf of bread. A gesture with no thought behind it. He scanned the kitchen, not openly snooping, but noticing. Clocking things. Every paused glance felt like a calculation. You really shouldn't be handling all these documents alone, he said, pulling out a neat folder from his bag. Medical forms, insurance, bills. I can take some of that off your shoulders. Just temporarily. Temporarily, from Brian, meant until control became permanent. Then came the moment. The first spike. As I leaned forward to reach my tea, Brian slipped his hand toward the drawer where Marilyn kept important papers, birth certificates, tax records, our will. He didn't open it. He just touched the handle lightly. Testing the boundary. It jolted something in me, a flash of heat I hadn't felt in months. I've got it handled, I said quietly. He stepped back, smiling like a politician conceding nothing. She arrived an hour later, letting herself in with the spare key she'd never bothered returning. Dad, she called in that sing-song voice she used when she wanted something. She hugged me with arms too tight, perfume too strong. For a second, I smelled Marilyn's old lotion and had to swallow hard. Jenna floated around the house, straightening pillows, smoothing blankets, picking up framed photos as if staging a home for sale. I just want things to feel comforting for you, she said. But her eyes kept drifting toward Marilyn's jewelry box on the bookshelf. Not with longing. With anticipation. She sat beside me, took my hand, and lowered her voice. If you need someone to handle the emotional things, the tough decisions, I'm here. You know I understand these things better than Brian does. It was a clever angle. Warmth disguised as authority. Her phone buzzed. The screen lit up before she could hide it. Brian, any update? Her face drained. She fumbled to flip the phone over. A crack in the performance. And for the first time all day, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not sorrow. Strategy. Kyle didn't come until evening, long after the sky had turned purple. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a child about to confess to breaking a window. Hey, Dad. Mind if I come in? His voice didn't have Brian's control or Jenna's sweetness. Just, tired honesty. He sat across from me, fists balled so tightly his knuckles whitened. I know we screwed up, he said. I know we weren't here. I should have been. His voice wavered. He blinked fast, trying to hold something back. For a moment, one brief moment, I saw guilt. Real, aching guilt. Then he added. Work's been rough, and I'm behind on a few things. I'm not asking for money. I'm just saying if you need someone to help manage anything. I'm here. There it was. The pivot. The reason he came. Kyle wasn't malicious. He was desperate. And desperation can be more dangerous than greed. I nodded softly. We'll talk soon. He exhaled like he'd been underwater. When Kyle left, the house slipped back into silence, the kind that buzzes behind your ears. I walked into Marilyn's sewing room, the one room none of the kids had entered. The air still carried the faint scent of fabric softener and lavender. On the table sat her half-finished quilt. She'd been sewing it for our granddaughter. Just a calculation. A timeline. Their eyes shifted between each other, quiet signals passing back and forth like they were preparing for a meeting rather than standing at the bedside of their father. And as they waited for my answer, I felt something in my chest, not pain, not grief. Something calmer. Something sharper. Because they had no idea that the moment they walked into this room, they weren't just visiting a dying man. They were stepping directly into the consequences of their own absence. And I was already years ahead of them. The next morning, the light coming through the curtains was thin and colorless, like the day hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Marilyn always said mornings like that meant something shifting. She never meant weather. She meant people. And she would have been right. I was halfway down the hall when I heard them. Not loud. Not scheming. Just, tense. Jenna's voice first, low and brittle. I don't know how to start this without sounding awful. Then Kyle. Maybe we don't start anything. Maybe we just, ask how he is. A pause. Small. Heavy. Brian's response came quieter than I expected, almost irritated. We tried that last time and he shut down. We need to be consistent. There was shuffling. Someone's foot tapping. Jenna again, softer now. He's our dad. He'll know why we're really here. Kyle let out a sigh that wasn't frustration, more like guilt. Brian said something I couldn't make out, just a murmur, and then. Just follow my lead. Not a plan. Not a conspiracy. But enough to tell me they had talked about this long before they showed up at my door. I stepped back into the living room before they knocked, heart settling into a patient, almost resigned rhythm. When I opened the door, they all froze, only for half a second, but it was there. A flicker of surprise. Something tightening behind the eyes. A silent adjustment into concerned child mode. Morning, Dad, Jenna said with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Kyle mumbled, hey, hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. Brian cleared his throat. Can we come in? I stepped aside. We ended up at the dining table, the one Marilyn and I ate every dinner at for 40 years. The wood felt colder than usual, polished too clean. They didn't sit all at once, it was staggered. Brian first. Jenna after she adjusted her sleeve 3 times. Kyle last, hovering like he wasn't sure he belonged there. The conversation started harmlessly. How are you feeling? Did you sleep? Any dizziness? They spoke over each other a little, leaving space, stepping on space, awkward in a way that almost felt genuine. Almost. Then Brian leaned back, hands clasped, and exhaled slowly. Dad, we've been thinking about some things. He didn't pull out the papers right away. He hesitated, long enough to seem conflicted. I know you're capable, he said. But this illness, it changes things. And we want to make sure everything is, well, in order. Jenna shifted. Her knee bounced once beneath the table. She forced it still. Not because of money, she said quickly. Too quickly. Just, life gets complicated. Kyle looked at her sharply, like he wasn't sure that was the right phrasing. Brian finally placed a thin folder on the table, not sliding it, not forcing it, just setting it down like he was offering a pamphlet from a doctor's office. Look it over, he said. When you're ready. Power of attorney. Medical consent. Nothing dramatic. Nothing blatantly predatory. But the timing, the sudden unity, was loud in its own way. Jenna reached for my hand. Not dramatic. Not greedy. Just, searching. Dad, she said softly, you don't have to give us anything. But we can help carry some of this. You've been carrying everything alone. Her eyes drifted, not toward the safe, not toward money, but toward the hallway where Marilyn kept important things, documents, sentimental items, old taxes. A natural glance. A familiar pathway. But it stirred something deeper, because Marilyn always locked that hallway cabinet when the kids were younger. She said it kept them from learning the wrong things too early. That memory landed harder than Jenna's touch. Kyle finally spoke. We just want to help, he said. And unlike the others, he sounded like he meant it. You don't have to decide today. For a moment, the room felt painfully normal. 3 grown children trying, clumsily, to do the right thing while also guarding their own fears. Then Brian broke the fragile balance. Dad. I know the past was complicated. But this is the practical step. For everyone. Everyone. Not me. Everyone. I closed the folder gently. I appreciate the thought, I said. But I'm not ready to hand over decisions yet. It wasn't confrontational. Just firm. Brian's lips parted as if to argue, but he caught himself. Jenna blinked quickly, like dust had drifted into her eye. Kyle stared at the table. No explosion. No shouting. Just 3 people realizing the conversation didn't go the way they practiced outside my door. They stood slowly. Okay, Kyle said, voice quiet. Jenna hugged me, longer than usual, like she wasn't sure when to let go. Brian hesitated by the door, jaw shifting, words forming then dying. When they stepped onto the porch, their voices didn't rise. No plotting. Just tired murmurs. Maybe give him space. We rushed it. He's scared. Not villains. Not angels. Just flawed people dealing with illness badly. I closed the door gently. I walked into Marilyn's sewing room. Her chair. Her fabric. Her half-finished quilt. And on her shelf, tucked between old books, was a note I hadn't noticed before, written years ago, judging by the yellowing tape holding it in place. Tom, people show their hearts when they're frightened. Listen closely, even when they whisper. Not a warning. Not a prophecy. Just Marilyn being Marilyn. I sat in her chair and folded the note into my pocket. My children weren't monsters. They were frightened. And frightened people make desperate choices. But so do fathers. And as I sat there, the beginnings of my own quiet plan clicked into place, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The days after their first visit didn't feel coordinated, just unusually crowded. Not a schedule. Not a plan. Just overlap. Like they were all suddenly afraid of letting each other get ahead. Tuesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea when someone knocked softly on the door. Jenna. She came in with a plastic bag of groceries, half thoughtful, half random, and placed them on the counter. I didn't know what you needed, she said. So I just grabbed things. Before I could respond, another knock came. Brian. His eyebrows shot up when I opened the door. I thought you said Thursday, he muttered, before catching himself. Oh. Jenna's here. Great. Good. He stepped inside, too quickly, brushing past both of us. For a moment, they stood in the kitchen like two co-workers arriving for the same shift by mistake. Jenna crossed her arms. Brian opened the fridge like he lived there. I waited for one of them to explain why they'd suddenly doubled their visits. Neither did. Instead, Jenna spoke first. Dad, your mail was sticking out of the box. I brought it in. Before I could thank her, Brian cut in. Did you sort it? Some of those bills are time-sensitive. He didn't mean it sharply, but it landed sharply. Jenna turned to me. I didn't open anything. I nodded. But the tightness in her jaw told me she heard the accusation anyway. Small wound. Small crack. The kind families pretend not to notice. Brian reached for the stack of mail Jenna had placed on the counter. Not to organize. Not even to help. Just, instinctively. Before I could react, he'd already flipped one envelope over and slid a finger under the seal. Brian, I said gently, I can open my own mail. He froze. Stopped mid-motion. Oh. Sorry. Habit. Habit. A strange word for a thing he had never done before. He placed the envelope down but left his hand on top of it, like if he moved it, he'd look even more guilty. Jenna's eyes drifted to his hand, and a flicker passed between them, something unspoken. Competition. Resentment. Fear of being outpaced. Something I wasn't meant to see. Kyle arrived unannounced 15 minutes later. He didn't ring. He stepped in through the back door like he used to when he was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. He stopped short when he saw his siblings. Oh. Everyone's here. Jenna sighed. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose. The room shifted, the air thickening into something that wasn't hostility, but wasn't comfort either. 3 adult children standing in a kitchen they didn't belong to anymore, each trying to act casual, each failing in small, human ways. Kyle broke the tension first. Dad, I brought some things for you. He reached into a bag and pulled out a bottle of supplements he clearly couldn't afford. Brian scoffed before he caught himself. Jenna threw him a warning look. Those are fine, Brian said too quickly, but he needs things that are actually clinically studied. Kyle's face tightened. I'm just trying to help. I didn't say you weren't, Brian said. Yes, you did, Jenna mumbled under her breath. Not loud. Not angry. Just tired. The kind of tired that reveals everything underneath. While they bickered softly, I walked to the living room. When I came back, all 3 stood near the hall closet, just close enough to be noticeable, not close enough to be caught doing anything wrong. The filing box was inside that closet. The one with the important documents. Kyle wasn't touching it. Jenna wasn't looking at it. Brian wasn't holding it. But their positions, all angled toward that closet, told the story. They weren't looting. They weren't scheming. They were curious. Anxious. Trying to guess what existed inside without daring to ask. A quiet, invisible pull. The kind that doesn't break the surface, but shifts the current underneath. Brian broke the moment. "Dad, have you thought more about, organizing things?" Jenna added softly, "Just so we're not scrambling later." Kyle didn't speak. He stared at the closet again, pretending he wasn't. Their words weren't cruel. Not manipulative. Just careful. Too careful. Like people approaching a wound they weren't sure they caused. I sat down. "I'm thinking about it," I said. That was all. But the way they reacted, 3 faces relaxing, shoulders dropping, breaths leaving in quiet relief, told me everything. They weren't trying to take control. They were trying to avoid being left without it. Fear. Not greed. Fear disguised as responsibility. After they left, staggered departures, awkward goodbyes, promises to check in tomorrow, I sat alone in the living room. Not angry. Not betrayed. Just, clearer. The house felt heavier than before, not because of illness, but because my children had finally shown me who they were under pressure. Brian, anxious and controlling. Jenna, fearful and performative. Kyle, overwhelmed and lost. Not bad people. Not villains. Just flawed. Flawed in ways that could hurt me if I wasn't careful. In the quiet, I reached for Marilyn's old book again, the one where I'd found that note. And instead of rereading her words, I simply held it for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle in my hands. I didn't need advice. I didn't need signs. I didn't need warnings. The truth was already in front of me. My children were drifting toward control out of fear. And I was drifting away from it out of survival. 2 forces slowly pulling in opposite directions. Something would give. But not yet. Not today. For 2 days after the overlapping visit, things quieted. Not peaceful. Just, paused. The kind of pause where everyone is waiting for someone else to act first. I could feel it in my phone, one child typing and deleting messages, another checking in without fully asking what they wanted to ask, and a third trying to stay neutral but worried he wasn't doing enough. Silence can be loud when people don't trust it. Late Wednesday morning, Brian sent a simple text. "Hey Dad, quick question. Do you remember where you put the insurance papers?" Not accusatory. Not demanding. Just too specific. Insurance papers aren't something you casually bring up unless you're thinking about them already. I answered honestly. "Should be in the hall cabinet." He replied. "Mind if I stop by later to double-check?" Double-check. A small phrase that said more than it meant to. When he arrived an hour later, earlier than he'd planned, he didn't bring coffee or a notebook. Just a quiet tension around the eyes. He wasn't snooping. He wasn't manipulating. He was searching, for reassurance, for proof, for confirmation that I hadn't changed something important without telling them. He walked toward the hall cabinet, then stopped, uncomfortable. "Do you want to look together?" he asked. Not forceful. Not controlling. Just scared of overstepping. We looked together. The papers were there. Untouched. Brian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all morning. But he didn't say why he was relieved. And I didn't ask. That afternoon, Jenna called. She didn't launch into a speech. She didn't arrive with groceries. She just asked, too softly. "Dad, were you upset with us last time? You seemed distant." Distant. The word caught me off guard. She continued before I could answer. "I told Brian I felt like you were pulling away. He said you weren't, but, you felt different. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining things." She wasn't imagining them. But I didn't correct her. Because what she was sensing wasn't anger. It was shift. I told her I was fine. But something in her voice cracked a little, not tears, just strain. "Okay," she said quietly. I I want to make sure we're not losing you again. Losing me. Not physically. Emotionally. Her fear wasn't money. It wasn't control. It was identity. If she wasn't the caretaker daughter, who was she? When she hung up, the silence in the room thickened. Kyle didn't come by until the evening, not rushing, not panicked. Just tired. He knocked lightly, pulled off his cap, and asked, "Is this a bad time?" He sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. We talked about small things at first, the yard, the weather, a neighbor he saw earlier. Then he said something so casual, he didn't realize what he was revealing. "Jenna said you asked Brian about the cabinet." I hadn't. Brian had asked me. Which meant. Brian told Jenna. Jenna told Kyle. Kyle thought I was the one who brought it up. 3 siblings. 3 versions of the same story. And underneath all of them. Fear. Confusion. And a quiet suspicion they didn't want to admit even to each other. Kyle rubbed his face. "Dad, whatever's happening, just let us in. If you make decisions alone, we start assuming the worst." Not angry. Not accusing. Just honest. And the worst, for Kyle, wasn't losing an inheritance. It was losing control of a situation he felt too fragile to manage. As he stood to leave, he paused by Marilyn's sewing room door, the door most people walked past without noticing. He didn't go in. He didn't open it. But he touched the doorknob. Just lightly. Barely a brush of his hand. Something unconscious. Instinctive. He didn't realize he'd done it. But I saw it. A boundary crossed without intention. It wasn't greed. It wasn't snooping. It was a scared son checking the perimeter of a life he was afraid was slipping through his fingers. After he left, I sat in a quiet house and let the day settle. For the first time, I didn't feel sharper. I felt older. Not weaker. Just aware. Aware that my children were unraveling in different ways. They were afraid of losing control. They didn't trust each other as much as they pretended. They didn't trust me to stay the version of myself they needed. And under all of that, I felt a strange sting of guilt. Because I had changed. The illness changed me. The silence changed me. 2 years alone changed me. The ER changed me. Their return changed me. And Marilyn's absence, that changed everything. I wasn't the man they remembered. And they weren't the children I remembered. People don't fracture all at once. They hairline crack. Quietly. Slowly. Invisible until the moment the whole shape shifts under pressure. We were mid-shift. All of us. For 2 days, the house stayed unusually still. No visits. No overlapping footsteps. Just a slow tightening in the air, like something unsaid was gathering weight in the walls. It wasn't peace. It was anticipation, the kind people feel when they're waiting for someone else to make the first move. Thursday morning, I called the clinic myself. Not because I needed anything urgent. Because I'd misplaced the little appointment card they had given me. It wasn't unusual, Marilyn used to keep track of these things. I asked the receptionist, "Could you remind me of the time for my follow-up next week?" There was a shuffle of papers on her end. "Of course, Mr. Harland. You're confirmed for Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Confirmed. Confirmed by who? I asked. By your family member, she said. A pause. I assumed it was you. I felt a small pulse in my neck. It wasn't dramatic. Not an alarm bell. Just a tightening, the way a door sounds when someone pulls it halfway closed and walks away. I didn't ask who called. Maybe I should have. But I hung up with the quiet, uncomfortable sense that a decision had been made for me, somewhere I wasn't standing. A misunderstanding, I told myself. Probably nothing. But it lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter. Around noon, only one child showed up. Not all three. Just Brian. He arrived with a folder tucked under his arm, not dramatic, not suspicious, just organized in the way he always tried to be when he didn't want to worry. I was in the area, he said. He wasn't. Brian never passed my neighborhood on weekdays. But I figured I'd drop this off. He placed the folder on the table. I could see labels poking out inside. What's all that? I asked. Well, after the last appointment, I started collecting some basic information. He hesitated. For emergencies. A reasonable explanation. A thoughtful one, even. But his foot tapped lightly against the floor, a nervous tick he usually managed to hide. And that's when I realized. He wasn't here to check on my health. He was here to confirm what he'd heard. Did the clinic call you? He asked, too casually. There it was. The real reason. I felt a flicker of embarrassment that I'd been caught off guard, a rare feeling these days. They did, I said. About the appointment. Brian's shoulders dropped slightly. Not in relief, in confirmation. He knew the call had come. He wanted to know how I'd interpreted it. I almost asked, did you call them? But I stopped myself. Because the answer wasn't the point. The point was that he was afraid of the same thing I was. A shift. A misunderstanding. A loss of control. Or maybe, simply, change. Later that afternoon, Jenna texted me. Are you home? That was unusual for her. She normally just appeared. I wrote back. Yes. She didn't arrive until nearly an hour later, meaning she had been hesitating, not rushing. When she walked in, she didn't look emotional. She looked uncertain, like a child entering a classroom late. I brought the cardigan you like, she said, holding it up. Thought it might be cold here. It wasn't. But I took it anyway. For a few minutes, she rearranged some cushions, wiped down a table, fussed with things that didn't need fussing. Then she sat. I heard you talk to the clinic, she said. It hit me then. She hadn't called them about attending the appointment. She had called them because she was worried I hadn't scheduled one at all. Not control. Not manipulation. Fear. Fear that I was avoiding treatment. Fear that I was slipping. It stung, not because she doubted me, but because she didn't trust herself not to panic. I'm going, I assured her. She nodded, but her eyes darted toward the hallway, toward Marilyn's sewing room. Not greed. Not curiosity. Just searching for something that wasn't there anymore. A mother. A buffer. A center. Kyle didn't show up until later in the evening. Not bursting in. Not frantic. He just knocked quietly and stood with his hands in his pockets. You busy? He asked. No. He stepped inside slowly, like he wasn't sure whether he was welcome. Jenna said you got a call from the clinic, he said. There it was again. The same thread, pulled from 3 different directions. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. I thought maybe. I dunno, maybe you forgot. Or got confused. I stiffened, but it wasn't anger. It was something far more vulnerable. The fear that maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. I had misplaced the appointment card. I had forgotten to refill a prescription last week. I had missed a call from the pharmacy without noticing. Small things. Normal things. But suddenly they felt, weighted. Kyle noticed my expression and backpedaled immediately. I didn't mean, I'm not saying you're losing it. I'm scared, Dad. The honesty hit harder than anything Brian or Jenna had said. Kyle wasn't trying to manage me. He didn't want control. He didn't even want responsibility. He just didn't want to watch another parent slip away. Not again. After Kyle left, I sat in the dark living room and let something happen that I had been holding back for weeks. I let doubt in. Real doubt. Not about my children. About myself. I pressed my hands together hard, elbows on my knees, breathing slow and uneven. What if I was slipping? What if the quiet moments of forgetfulness weren't just grief or age or exhaustion? What if their fear wasn't overreach, but recognition? For the first time, the story wasn't. They're circling me. It was. What if they're right? It wasn't panic. It wasn't defeat. It was a new kind of clarity. The kind that doesn't sharpen you, but humbles you. When the lights were still off and the house was nothing but shapes and shadows, I whispered something out loud for the first time since the diagnosis. I'm not sure. Not sure about the appointment. Not sure about my strength. Not sure about my memory. Not sure about how much to let them help. Or how much to keep to myself. And in that moment, I realized. They weren't the only ones afraid of losing control. So was I. The morning of the appointment the air smelled faintly of coffee and rain, nothing dramatic, just that clean, ordinary smell that makes small decisions feel heavier. I dressed slower than usual, not out of fatigue, but because my hands wanted the ritual: button, fold. Marilyn used to say people make big moves in tiny, ordinary moments. She was right. I expected the appointment to be routine. I expected questions about medication, maybe a gentle suggestion for a memory test. What I didn't expect was the doctor's offhand observation to land like a small legal nudge. He read the notes. He smiled kindly. Then he said, quietly, "Mr. Harland, part of follow-up care is ensuring you have decision-makers who are truly independent. The state has strict rules about conflicts of interest." I blinked. He went on, "If your family becomes the only decision-makers, it complicates things. Often a neutral third party, a professional fiduciary or an independent trustee, prevents legal fights later. It also protects the patient's wishes." It was sensible. Clinical. Not dramatic. But to me it sounded like an invitation, a legal doorway I hadn't walked through yet. I left the office with that sentence curling in my head: neutral third party. Outside the clinic, my children clustered like a small weather front. They were nervous, yes, but they were also rehearsed, each had a version of concern they'd been practicing. They asked the questions they'd been practicing. I answered the way I always did, calmly, carefully. Inside my answers I let them find hope. Let them assume. Let them rehearse the future where they were the stewards of my life and my money. It soothed them. It gave them purpose. That was the misdirection. They assumed I would appoint family. I let them assume. It kept them earnest, and it kept them honest in a way arguments never could. A week earlier, weeks before any of this converged, I'd signed paperwork with my attorney. It wasn't dramatic paperwork: an irrevocable trust, a professional fiduciary named as trustee, and a set of caretaker directives that separated medical advocacy from financial control. Two important effects. The trust held the investment accounts and crypto assets. They were managed by a professional trustee with firm distribution rules, staggered disbursements, taxes handled by the trust, penalties for premature claims. The kids inherited beneficiaries, not a single unlocked fortune. A healthcare power of attorney, also assigned, went to someone who had no stake in the money and who had been recommended by Marilyn years ago, her sister, Aunt Rose. Not because I wanted to cut the children out of care, but because I wanted caregiving decisions made by someone who owed no loyalty to money. Both moves were boring, technical, and irrevocable. They also solved the problems the doctor had mentioned: conflict of interest, family feuds, questions about undue influence. And they meant, in practice, that my children could no longer act as the single gatekeepers they'd imagined. I told them sitting at the kitchen table, not theatrically, not triumphantly. I said it like reporting the weather. I set the trust, I said. A professional trustee manages the funds. Taxes, distributions, everything are handled there. Brian blinked. He looked like a man whose map had tilted. I appointed Aunt Rose as my health agent, I said next. That last name landed differently than I thought it would. Brian's face went immediate and sharp, confusion, then something closer to anger. Rose, he repeated. You mean her? She lives 3 states away. She hardly knows our lives. Jenna's mouth opened. For the first time since I'd been ill, she seemed unmoored, not angry, not composed, just unmade. Kyle's reaction was quieter. He sat back and folded his hands, fists tucked under his palms. So, you didn't pick us, he said. Not accusing. Not pleading. Just stating. I could feel the room tilt. But I also felt something else, a small relieved sense of having finally put in place the one thing Marilyn and I had always agreed on, sensible, unemotional protection. They didn't react as a chorus. They fractured as 3 separate weather patterns. Brian, the control-minded son, went defensive. You can't just hand this to someone who isn't here. What if she doesn't understand our local bank, our bills? We need direct access. His voice had that precise, practiced edge. He wanted procedures. He wanted to know how to appeal the trustee. He was already thinking of legal routes. Jenna, whose identity had been wrapped around caretaking, broke differently. She made small sounds that weren't quite sobs. Mom trusted you, she whispered. If you don't trust us, why did we spend so much time together? Her grief was private and raw, it wasn't performative. She looked like she could dissolve if someone touched her wrong. Kyle, the guilty, practical one, reacted quietly, with a shame that felt like acceptance. If you think Rose will keep you safe, okay. He looked at his hands, the lines near his nails. He didn't know whether relief or loss sat in his chest. He wanted to be useful yet feared being used. They were different. Each reaction told us more about who they were than any argument ever could. There was a moment, later, after they left, after the polite goodbyes, when I sat in Marilyn's chair and felt a thin tremor of doubt. Not about the legal choices. Not about Aunt Rose. About myself. Had I been unkind? Had I been too secretive? Had my need to protect become a refusal to trust the flawed people I had helped raise? I clutched at the paper the attorney had given me, the trust summary, the names, the clauses, the notary stamp. In the dim light I realized I had done something irreversible and perhaps necessary. I allowed myself a single, human mistake, a wetness in my eyes, a small hitch in the voice when I spoke aloud to the empty room. I hope they forgive me. That moment mattered. It made the decision human, not heroic. The children returned over the next weeks with questions, lawyers' calls, small strident demands that the trustee answer simple things immediately. The trustee replied politely, with legalese and patience. Distributions were scheduled. Tax liabilities were calculated and paid out of the trust. The professional neutrality the doctor had recommended worked, in the cold practical way it is meant to work. But it left an ache that paperwork can't fix. Jenna stopped coming by as often. When she did, she brought bread and left it at the door. Brian called more, his voice professional and clipped. Kyle visited on Sundays, staying for a little longer each time, sitting in his old chair like a man testing whether belonging would take him back. We were not reconciled. We were rearranged. I had protected my wishes. I had removed opportunity for immediate exploitation. I had also chosen a route that forced my children to reconcile with themselves, not with me. As the sun set on the house that evening, I stood at the window and watched them go. Not triumphantly. Not in sorrow that could be neat. Just watching, like a person seeing a weather change, knowing you can't stop it, but knowing you prepared the house to weather it. Maybe they would hate the choice. Maybe some of the hurt would never heal. Maybe consequences would spread like cracks. But in the smallest, truest way, for the first time in a long while, I felt I had made a decision I would not regret. And that, in its quiet, imperfect way, was what I needed most.